Some places hold more waiting for the next unsuspecting guest. From the cursed room 13 that reveals your darkest fears to the silent bellboy who hasn't aged a day. These are the tales of haunted hotels where reality bends, whispers echo, and shadows follow. Would you dare step into the courtyard that cries for help? Or face the unblinking gaze of a portrait that moves when no one's looking? And what about the guest who never checked out? What happens when you're the next to take their place? These are the most haunted hotels in the US. You shouldn't stay at, and each story will make you question what lurks behind closed doors. Story 1. The Room That Doesn't Exist. I had no intention of staying the night. The plan was simple. Take a few pictures of the abandoned third floor, tell some ghost stories with friends, and leave before midnight. But when the elevator doors opened to a room that didn't exist, my plans unraveled. I first heard about the Glenfield Hotel from a podcast that covered haunted locations. The host spoke about it with an almost reverent fear, describing its infamous Room 13 as a cursed place where reality bends, time warps, and sanity crumbles. I was hooked. When I brought it up to my friends, Cassie and Ben, they were skeptical but intrigued. Cassie, in particular, loved urban legends and saw this as an opportunity to debunk one. Ben was less enthused but couldn't resist the challenge, especially with Cassie teasing him about being scared. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the hotel's crumbling facade. Its once grand design, arched windows, ornate cornices, and a towering spire now looked like the set of a gothic horror film. Inside, the Glenfield was no better. The lobby reeked of damp wood and old carpet. A single chandelier hung precariously above, its flickering bulbs casting uneven light. We approached the front desk where a tired clerk glanced up briefly, clearly uninterested. "Hi, we're just here to look around," Cassie said, flashing her most charming smile. The clerk raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Just don't go past the second floor. The upper levels are unsafe." We nodded, knowing full well we weren't going to listen. At 10 p.m., with the lobby empty, we made our move. Cassie's friend had left the service elevator unlocked for us, just as promised. The elevator ride was slow, every jolt making the small metal box groan like it might collapse. Ben joked that the ghosts were already trying to sabotage us, but no one laughed. When the doors opened to the third floor, a blast of cold air greeted us. The hallway stretched out before us like a tunnel, lined with peeling wallpaper and warped wood paneling. The only light came from our flashlights, which struggled to cut through the dense shadows. "This is it," Cassie whispered. We began exploring, passing room after room. Most doors were sealed shut, their numbers missing or illegible. A few hung open, revealing dusty furniture, cobwebs, and the faint scent of mildew. The deeper we went, the stranger things became. The air grew colder, heavy with an unshakable sense of being watched. Our footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the hallway stretched far beyond what we could see. "This place is a maze," Ben muttered. It was then that we noticed something odd. The hallway was looping. We'd passed the same boarded-up door 3 times, despite walking straight. Finally, we stopped in front of a door with the faint outline of the number 13 scratched into the wood. "This is it," Cassie said, her excitement barely masking her fear. "Are we really doing this?" I asked, my voice wavering. "We came all this way," she replied, pushing the door open. Inside, the room was smaller than I expected. A single bed sat in the corner, its mattress yellowed with age. A wooden chair stood by the window, which was so filthy it barely let in any light. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as we stood there, a heavy silence enveloped us, an unnatural quiet that made my ears ring. Then came the first sign. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move. It wasn't just a trick of the light. The shadows rippled, stretching and bending as if alive. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "Do you see that?" I whispered. Cassie nodded, her face pale. Ben turned on his phone's flashlight, but the beam flickered and died almost instantly. "What the hell?" he muttered, shaking his phone. That's when the whispers began. They were faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But they grew louder, overlapping and weaving into an eerie chorus. "Let us out." "Why are you here?" "Stay." The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room with an oppressive energy. "I'm done," I said, moving toward the door. But it was locked. "Cassie, open the door," Ben shouted, tugging at the handle. "I didn't lock it," she yelled back, panic rising in her voice. We all pulled on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, almost drowning out our frantic breathing. Then came the scratching. It started in the walls, faint and intermittent, like claws dragging across wood. It grew closer, moving toward the closet. "What's in there?" Cassie asked, her voice trembling. "Nothing," I said, though I didn't believe it. The scratching turned into pounding, as though something inside was desperate to get out. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer and reached for the closet door. The moment I touched the handle, the pounding stopped. For a second, everything was silent. Then the door flew open, slamming against the wall. The closet was empty, but the air felt charged, like static electricity before a storm. I stumbled back, and that's when the bed began to move. It started subtly, the mattress shifting as though something underneath it was struggling to escape. Then it lifted, just slightly, but enough to reveal blackened, clawed hands gripping the edges. I froze, unable to look away, as a face began to emerge. It was pale and sunken, its eyes hollow and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "Get out!" it rasped, the voice layered with dozens of others. The lights in the room exploded, plunging us into darkness. I felt something cold wrap around my ankle, yanking me toward the bed. "Help!" I screamed, kicking wildly. Cassie and Ben grabbed me, pulling me free. We scrambled for the door, which now swung open on its own. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for air. The next day, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Cassie insisted we had hallucinated, that the old building's mold and poor air quality had messed with our heads. But Ben didn't say a word. He just stared at his scratched-up arms. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us home. At night, I'd hear whispers in my room, faint and fleeting. The Glenfield Hotel may not officially acknowledge Room 13, but I'll never forget it. If you ever find yourself there, do yourself a favor. Stay far away from the third floor. Story 2. The Silent Bellboy. He never spoke a word, just that eerie smile and a slow nod as he handed me the old-fashioned room key. I travel a lot for work, so I've stayed in my fair share of hotels. Some were luxurious, some were barely livable, and a few were outright bizarre. But nothing could have prepared me for the Holloway Hotel. It wasn't supposed to be my destination. A sudden thunderstorm had grounded my flight, leaving me stranded in a small Midwestern town I'd never heard of. My phone was nearly dead, and the airport staff suggested the Holloway as my only option for the night. When I pulled up, the place looked wrong. It had that faded charm of an old building trying to hold on to its glory days, but the heavy storm clouds above made it feel oppressive. The large neon Holloway Hotel sign flickered erratically, casting strange shadows over the parking lot. Inside, the air was musty, and the dim lighting didn't help. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, seemed surprised to see me. "Checking in?" she asked almost cautiously. "Yes, just for the night," I replied, wiping rainwater off my jacket. She hesitated for a moment, then handed me a heavy brass key attached to a leather tag that read, "Room 207. The bellboy will show you to your room," she said, pressing a button behind the desk. I frowned. A bellboy? This place didn't look like it could afford one. A moment later, he appeared. The bellboy couldn't have been older than 20, dressed in a red uniform that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his black hair was slicked back neatly. But it was his eyes that unnerved me. They were a little too wide, a little too unblinking, as if he were taking in more than he should. He didn't speak. He simply smiled, a thin, unsettling smile, and gestured for me to follow. As we walked through the dim hallways, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The bellboy moved soundlessly, his footsteps making no noise on the threadbare carpet. When we reached room 207, he handed me the key, his smile never wavering. Thanks, I muttered, but he didn't respond. He just nodded and walked away. The moment I stepped into the room, a chill ran through me. The room wasn't dirty, but it felt wrong, like it hadn't been touched in years. The furniture was outdated, the wallpaper was faded, and the air smelled faintly of sulfur. The only modern touch was the flat-screen TV, which didn't seem to work. I decided to brush it off. It was just one night after all, but things didn't stay quiet for long. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my door. They were slow and deliberate, stopping right in front of room 207. I held my breath, waiting for a knock or the sound of a key in the lock. But there was nothing, just silence. After a few minutes, I worked up the courage to peek through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I climbed back into bed, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. The next morning, I headed to the lobby for breakfast. The receptionist greeted me with a tight smile, but when I mentioned the bellboy, her expression changed. "We don't have a bellboy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I laughed nervously. "What are you talking about? He showed me to my room last night." Her face went pale. "That's impossible." I felt a pit form in my stomach. "Who was he then?" She hesitated, then leaned in closer. "You're not the first to see him," she said. "The bellboy used to work here, decades ago. He died in a fire on the second floor." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to leave immediately, but I still had hours before my flight. I decided to stay in the lobby for as long as I could. But even in the bustling space, I felt uneasy. That night, I returned to room 207 reluctantly. I double-checked the locks and left the lights on, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of someone breathing. It was faint but steady, coming from the corner of the room. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight. When I pointed it at the corner, it was empty. Then the TV turned on by itself. The screen flickered to life, displaying static. I fumbled with the remote, trying to turn it off, but the buttons wouldn't respond. Suddenly, an image appeared, a blurry black and white video of a man in a bellboy uniform staring directly at the camera. It was him. He smiled that same unsettling smile, and then the screen went dark. I grabbed my suitcase and bolted out of the room, not caring about the rain outside. When I reached the lobby, I found the receptionist gone. I left the key on the desk and ran to my car, vowing never to return to the Holloway Hotel. To this day, I can still see his face in my mind. That thin smile, those unblinking eyes. If you ever find yourself stranded in a storm, think twice before checking into the Holloway Hotel. Story 3. The Cries in the Courtyard. I thought it was the wind at first, but as the night deepened, the cries grew louder, agonizing, human, and impossible to ignore. When I booked a room at the Oakwood Inn, I didn't know much about it beyond its quaint description online. A charming, historic getaway nestled in a quiet southern town. I wasn't looking for charm, though. I was looking for convenience. My cousin's wedding was happening the next day, and every other hotel in town was either booked or too far out of the way. The Oakwood seemed harmless enough when I pulled up in my rental car. The exterior had that weathered elegance you find in old southern estates. ivy-covered brick walls, tall windows with wrought iron balconies, and a sprawling courtyard in the center. But there was something unsettling about the place that I couldn't put my finger on. Maybe it was the shadows cast by the courtyard's large trees, or the way the warm evening air felt strangely heavy, pressing against my skin. I shook it off as exhaustion from the long drive and carried my suitcase inside. The receptionist greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was an older woman, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her demeanor polite but distant. "You're in room 202, she said, sliding a small brass key across the counter. "It's one of our balcony rooms, overlooking the courtyard. Enjoy your stay." I thanked her, took the key, and climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something damp, like freshly turned soil. When I opened the door to my room, I was pleasantly surprised. The interior was warm and inviting. Polished hardwood floors, soft yellow walls, and a canopy bed draped with white linens. The balcony doors let in the dim glow of the courtyard's string lights, and I stepped outside for a better look. The courtyard was beautiful in its simplicity. A stone fountain bubbled softly in the center, surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges and flower beds bursting with color. The fairy lights strung between the trees swayed gently in the breeze. Yet, even in its beauty, there was something about the courtyard that made me uneasy. The air felt charged, as if the space was holding its breath. That night, I settled into bed, trying to shake the strange feeling. The mattress was comfortable, and the soft hum of the fountain should have lulled me to sleep. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling inexplicably tense. At 2:13 a.m., I heard it for the first time, a faint cry. It was soft, barely audible over the sound of the fountain, but unmistakably human. I sat up, straining to listen. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so profound it made my ears ring. I told myself it must have been the wind, some trick of the trees or the water in the fountain, and forced myself back to sleep. The second night was worse. I returned to the inn after the wedding, feeling drained and ready for bed. I didn't even bother undressing, collapsing onto the mattress fully clothed. But just like the night before, sleep refused to come. At exactly 3:07 a.m., the cries began again. This time, they were louder. What started as faint sobbing quickly grew into anguished wails, each one more desperate than the last. I felt my chest tighten, my breathing shallow as I listened. I climbed out of bed and stepped onto the balcony. The courtyard was bathed in soft, golden light from the fairy lights. The fountain gurgled softly, but it was empty. I leaned over the railing, scanning the shadows under the trees. The cries continued, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Is someone out there?" I called. The crying stopped, and then faintly, I heard it, a whisper. "Help us." The next morning, I went straight to the receptionist. She looked up from her crossword puzzle, startled by my urgency. "I heard crying last night," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "In the courtyard, it woke me up." Her expression darkened. "It's probably just the wind," she said, a little too quickly. "It wasn't the wind," I insisted. "It sounded like people." She hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "There's a story," she said finally, her voice low. "It's old, goes back decades. There was a flood here back when the courtyard was just a garden. A storm came through one night, and the rain filled the courtyard faster than anyone expected. The lower floors flooded. Some of the guests couldn't get out in time." She paused, wringing her hands. "Some people say they still hear them on stormy nights. But it's just a story," she added hastily. "Nothing to worry about." That night, I couldn't shake her words. I kept telling myself it was just a story, an old myth passed down to scare tourists. But when 3:07 a.m. came, the cries returned. This time, I recorded them. I opened my phone's camera and held it steady, aiming it at the courtyard. The cries grew louder, more frantic, as if they were responding to me. And then I saw them. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, barely more than outlines, faint and translucent. A man, a woman, and a child. They moved slowly, their heads bowed, their postures hunched with despair. The man reached toward the fountain, his hand passing through the stone as if it wasn't there. The woman cradled the child, her mouth moving soundlessly. I stood frozen, unable to breathe. Then, as if sensing me, the child turned her head and looked directly at my balcony. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes wide and black as voids. "Help us," she whispered. Her voice wasn't loud, but it felt like it was inside my head, filling every corner of my mind. The woman looked up next, her gaze locking onto mine. Her lips curled into a snarl, and she screamed, "Why didn't you help us?" Her voice was deafening, a roar that rattled the glass doors behind me. I stumbled backward, slamming the doors shut and pulling the curtains closed. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I packed my things and left without looking back. It took me weeks to gather the courage to review the video on my phone. The first few minutes were normal, just an empty courtyard under flickering lights. But at 3:07 a.m., the screen glitched. When it came back, the 3 figures were standing perfectly still, staring directly at the camera. Their mouths moved in unison, forming silent words. And then the child smiled. I deleted the video, but I still hear their cries sometimes. Late at night, when everything else is silent, they find me. If you ever stay at the Oakwood Inn, avoid the courtyard at all costs. Some places never let go of their dead. Story 4. The portrait in the hallway. The eyes in the portrait didn't just seem alive, they followed me. I could swear I heard them blink. I had always loved staying in old inns. There's something enchanting about places with a history, where the walls seem to hold whispers of the past. But my stay at the Silver Hollow Inn made me rethink that love. It was a last-minute decision. A business trip brought me to the small New England town, and by the time I arrived, most of the accommodations were fully booked. The Silver Hollow Inn was the only place with a vacancy. From the outside, the inn looked charming, if a bit worn. A Victorian-style mansion with ivy crawling up its weathered walls. Its large windows glowed warmly in the evening light. The receptionist, a woman in her 60s with a polite but distracted demeanor, handed me an old-fashioned brass key and gave me directions to my room. "The second floor," she said, left at the end of the hallway. As I climbed the creaky staircase, I noticed the portraits. They lined the walls of the narrow corridor, each one depicting stern-looking individuals dressed in old-fashioned clothing. Most of the frames were dusty, their brass plates tarnished, but one stood out. It was larger than the others, dominating the center of the hallway. The man in the portrait was striking, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to follow me as I passed. His expression was cold, almost scornful, and the plaque beneath the painting read, "Edwin Blackwell, 1862-1910. I shivered, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. My room was quaint but comfortable. A soft bed with a patchwork quilt, a writing desk by the window, and an antique wardrobe in the corner. After unpacking, I decided to explore the inn before settling in for the night. The hallway was eerily quiet. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet, pausing once again in front of Edwin Blackwell's portrait. The closer I got, the more unsettling it became. His eyes, a vivid blue against the muted tones of the painting, seemed almost alive. I could feel his gaze on me even when I turned my back. "Creepy, huh?" I jumped, turning to see another guest, a woman about my age wearing jeans and a sweater, standing a few feet away. "Sorry," she said, laughing nervously. "Didn't mean to scare you. That guy gives me the creeps too. It's like he's watching you, right? Yeah, I admitted. It's unsettling. She introduced herself as Lauren, and we chatted briefly about the inn. She'd been staying there for a few days and mentioned hearing strange noises at night. Whispers, footsteps, even the sound of furniture moving. Probably just old pipes, I said, trying to dismiss it. But her uneasy expression lingered in my mind as I returned to my room. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The room felt colder than it should have, and the wind outside howled like a living thing. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps that paused right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for a knock, but none came. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with unsettling images. I saw Edwin Blackwell standing at the foot of my bed, his piercing blue eyes boring into mine. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. When I woke, my heart was pounding. The next day, I decided to ask the receptionist about the portrait. "Oh, that one," she said, her tone dismissive. "That's Mr. Blackwell, one of the original owners of the inn. He was particular." "Particular?" I asked. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "He was known for being difficult, some say cruel. There are stories about him, but they're just that, stories. Nothing to worry about." I wanted to press her for more details, but a ringing phone pulled her attention away. That evening, I found myself staring at the portrait again. I don't know why I felt drawn to it, but something about it demanded my attention. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before. There were faint scratches along the edges of the frame, as though someone had tried to pry it from the wall. "Are you still here, Mr. Blackwell?" I murmured, half joking. The moment I said it, a chill ran down my spine. I felt an almost imperceptible shift in the air, like the room was holding its breath. I hurried back to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, the disturbances began in earnest. It started with a faint tapping sound, like fingernails against wood. I thought it was coming from the wardrobe, but when I opened it, there was nothing inside except my neatly hung clothes. Then the whispers began, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I tried to drown them out by turning on the TV, but the screen only flickered with static. The whispers grew louder, and for a moment I thought I heard my name. And then the portrait was there. It was impossible. The painting had been in the hallway, but now it hung above the desk in my room, its blue-eyed subject staring down at me with that same cold expression. I froze, my mind racing for an explanation. Had someone moved it as a prank? But who? I approached the portrait cautiously, half expecting it to move or speak. As I reached out to touch the frame, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, and I could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. That's when I saw it. His lips, painted, unmoving, twitched. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The air in the room grew icy, and the shadows seemed to shift and writhe. Grabbing my phone, I snapped a picture of the portrait, desperate to capture proof of what I'd seen. The moment the flash went off, the room plunged into darkness. The lights flickered wildly, and I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps approaching from the hallway. They stopped right outside my door. I didn't wait to see who or what was there. Grabbing my bag, I bolted for the door, throwing it open to find the hallway empty. The portraits on the walls seemed darker, their subjects' faces obscured by shadows. But Edwin Blackwell's portrait was back in its place, hanging in the hallway as if it had never moved. The next morning, I checked out without a word, leaving the Silver Hollow Inn behind. When I reviewed the photo on my phone, my stomach dropped. The picture was clear, but it didn't show Edwin Blackwell. Instead, the canvas was blank. Story 5. The Guest Who Never Checked Out. The front desk clerk smiled apologetically. "That room has been occupied for 30 years. No one checks out." I wasn't supposed to be at the Crescent Pines Motel. My plan was to reach my destination before nightfall, but bad weather and a wrong turn left me stranded on a desolate stretch of highway. The rain was relentless, and when I saw the flickering neon sign reading Crescent Pines, vacancy, I had no choice but to pull in. The building looked like it had been plucked straight out of a 1960s postcard, single-story, L-shaped with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The parking lot was empty except for an old pickup truck near the office. I hesitated, gripping the steering wheel, but the storm left me no other option. The interior of the office was dimly lit, smelling faintly of damp carpet and cigarette smoke. A bell sat on the counter and I tapped it, the metallic clang echoing in the silence. A man emerged from the back, his face lined with deep wrinkles that made it hard to guess his age. He wore a faded flannel shirt and a weary smile. "Got caught in the storm, huh?" he said. "Yeah," I replied. "Do you have a room?" "Only one left," he said, reaching under the counter and pulling out a key attached to a brass tag. "Room 6. I noticed the hesitation in his movements, the way his eyes flickered toward the key as if reluctant to hand it over. "It's a bit old-fashioned," he added, "but it'll do for the night." I didn't care about old-fashioned. I just wanted shelter. Room 6 was at the far end of the row. The rain had eased to a drizzle by the time I parked in front of the door. The room was exactly what I expected: dated wallpaper, a creaky bed, and a boxy TV perched on a dresser. The only light came from a single bulb in the ceiling, casting harsh shadows that seemed to stretch too far. I locked the door behind me, threw my bag on the bed, and sat down to catch my breath. That's when I noticed it: the faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic. The rain picked up again, pounding against the window. I told myself I was overthinking things and decided to shower before getting some rest. When I stepped out of the bathroom, the room felt different. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint. The air felt heavier and the shadows seemed darker, more pronounced. I glanced at the bed and froze. My suitcase, which I'd left zipped up, was open. My clothes were neatly folded inside, but I hadn't touched it. I checked the door, it was still locked, and the window was latched shut. Trying to convince myself I'd forgotten unzipping it, I closed the suitcase and slid it under the bed. I turned on the TV, hoping for some background noise to calm my nerves. The static buzzed loudly, the screen flickering in and out. As I fiddled with the dial, the static abruptly cut out, replaced by a grainy black and white image of the room I was sitting in. At first I thought it was some kind of glitch, but then I noticed the detail, the exact angle of the bed, the door slightly ajar, the faint outline of my suitcase under the bed. It wasn't a recording, it was live. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, when something moved in the corner of the frame. A figure, faint and blurry, standing just outside the bathroom door. I whipped around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the TV, the image was gone, replaced by static once more. I didn't sleep that night. The shadows in the room seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, and I swore I heard faint whispers coming from the bathroom. I spent most of the night sitting on the edge of the bed, clutching my phone and staring at the door. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of someone knocking. "Housekeeping," a voice called. I glanced at the clock. 6:30 a.m., too early for housekeeping. When I approached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. "Hello?" I called out. No response. I opened the door slowly, peeking out into the empty walkway. The rain had stopped, and the sky was a dull gray. There was no sign of anyone. I went to the office to return my key. The same man from the night before greeted me with a nod, his expression unreadable. "How was the room?" he asked, his tone cautious. I hesitated. "Fine," I lied. "Quiet." He raised an eyebrow but didn't press me. As I handed him the key, I asked, "Has anyone ever mentioned strange things in room 6? His hand froze halfway to the counter. "What kind of strange things?" he asked, his voice tight. I described the suitcase, the TV, and the knocking. His face grew pale and he let out a long sigh. "You're not the first," he said finally. He leaned in, lowering his voice. 30 years ago, a man checked into room 6. No one knows much about him except that he never left. Staff found the room locked from the inside, and when they broke in, he was gone. All his belongings were still there, untouched. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. After that, people started seeing things, he continued, hearing things. Guests complained about noises, objects moving, even shadows in the mirrors. "Why don't you stop renting it out?" I asked. He gave me a sad smile. "We don't. But no matter what we do, the key always comes back, and someone always ends up staying." I left the Crescent Pines Motel as quickly as I could, the man's words echoing in my mind. When I got home, I tried to put it all behind me, but the experience stayed with me. 2 weeks later, I found my suitcase sitting in the corner of my bedroom. I had left it in the closet. Inside was an old brass key with a familiar tag. Room 6.